All right, well, welcome to part one. This is going to be titled Current Events. And what this part is about is really looking at probably in the last 10, 15 years of very significant changes in dispensationalism, in Zionism, Christian Zionism, and so on. I debated doing all of this in like some sort of a linear format, but I realized the better way to do this is kind of like going full circle. So my point is we're going to start with current events, i.e. the end right now, and then go to the beginning and then come back. We're going to look at individual threads and we're going to, line them all up at the very end. So it's going to be quite a fun little journey. But nonetheless, I want to show you what has shifted with dispensationalism because it's extremely significant. And this is what made me start to realize how all these things are being integrated. And it's just like one thing led to another. I'm like, oh man, I have to get this out. This is crazy. So I'm very grateful to God for opening my eyes, but we're going to discuss a couple of very key articles so that you get some perspective. This is from 2014, The New Apostolic Reformation and Christian Zionism. It's a journal in JSTOR. It's a paper. Abstract. One of the new religious movements is that of the New Apostolic Reformation. Within the NAR, the primacy of the apostle should be noted, who also functions in the role of a teacher by accurately decoding God's divine blueprint for this season. The NAR of the South often aligns themselves in vintage Berean style as people who search the scriptures daily. No, they don't, but anyway. Their actual practice reveals the important role of the charismatic founder/leader in determining the interpretation. Yeah, true. This role is evident in the perpetuation of the Pentecostal charismatic support of Christian Zionism. Extremely important. Christian Zionism grounds itself on the interpretation that God has an ongoing special relationship with the Jewish people apart from the church. Jews have a divine right to possess the land of Palestine. According to Christian Zionists, however, this divine right extends beyond the promise to Abraham and becomes a command to every Christian believer to unreservedly support the modern nation state of Israel. A pilot study was conducted in 2012 to explore inter alia NAR views on the Kairos Palestine document. This study attempts to build on that research. A qualitative methodology was chosen with the use of a focus group of key leaders of the NAR. While this study did not receive a decisive response from these NAR adherents, they had begun to study the Bible on this issue in earnest. This in and of itself is a promising starting point, as one of its stated NAR mandates is to influence the governmental political mountain. Perhaps the NAR of the South may yet make a more biblical grounded response to Christian Zionism. Again, this was about 10 years ago. And this is kind of when the NAR, it's really been around like since the mid-90s. We'll take a look at more specific history. But early 2000s, it started to infiltrate Christian Zionism. And you'll see what I mean. It's just so profound. This is from actually the Wayback Machine, because for some reason this thing wasn't pulling up on their website. But it's dated the April 14th, 2017, so 7 years ago. Meet Bibi's new tribulation courting, Jew converting, demon exorcising American allies. What a fascinating article. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been one of the most beloved Israeli politicians in the history of Christian Zionism. It has been a religio-political match made in heaven, with Christian right leaders providing Netanyahu with money in Israel and political clout in the U.S., and the Israeli leader putting up with an evangelical end times theology. So they have a nice little dance together, and of course that dance is about to integrate. But while Netanyahu is still in office, his Christian Zionist dance partners have changed. They no longer adhere to the fantastical but generally passive end times theology from which Christian Zionism emerged. Pay attention. This was 7 years ago. Today's Christian Zionists hail from apostolic and prophetic movements such as the New Apostolic Reformation, a demon-haunted new generation of American religio-politics, which may change the terms of the American-Israeli right-wing partnership in the bargain. It was Jerry Falwell, a name you need to remember, because we're going to look at him a couple times, who brokered the unlikely political partnership between American fundamentalists and Israeli politicians during the administration of the Menachem Begin, founder of the Likud party. The evangelical end times prophetic narrative, well captured in books like Hal Lindsey's Late Great Planet Earth, The Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye, one of the founders of the Moral Majority, which is also interesting to note, was central to this alliance. In this interpretation of biblical prophecy, believers are raptured or suddenly snatched to heaven prior to the 7 years before Jesus' return, a time when the Antichrist will rule over the earth in the Great Tribulation. Of course, none of that is true, but just so you're familiar. Today, the most prominent organization in Christian Zionism is Christians United for Israel, CUFI, led by controversial pastor John Hagee. CUFI has moved tens of millions of dollars from the U.S. to Israel, but is not required to disclose its activities because it's technically a church. There you go, registered in Texas. CUFI Church Association with a mission to proclaim Christ to the world. Not the Christ of the Scriptures, that's for sure. Hagee's theology is somewhat consistent with Lindsay's and LaHaye's in his fiery dispensationalist sermons. Now, remember, he's a dispensationalist. There's going to be something that he says that's very interesting coming up. He teaches that the rapture could take place at any minute. While the futuristic end times prophecy narrative predicts a grim outcome for Jews, this is essentially a passive tale that requires supernatural intervention and that many Jewish leaders don't take seriously. Often, they would literally laugh it off. One common joke is, quote, "When the Messiah comes, we'll just ask if he's been here before or not." But Christian Zionism has recently been transformed by a new generation with a radically different ideology that actively seeks to proselytize in Israel, Eastern Europe, South America, and which promotes an aggressive Christian nationalism in the U.S. today. In the U.S., today's Christian Zionism is dominated by the charismatic Pentecostal sector of Christianity, with the NAR first and foremost. Several CUFI directors, past and present, are part of the NAR leadership, and NAR spokespeople have gained prominence in Christian Zionist circles. Get to know the NAR. They are the future of the Christian right. Their leaders describe themselves as modern-day apostles and prophets, anointed by God to reform the church in preparation for the end times. This is a triumphalist theology, one in which the adherents believe they will exercise dominion over all of American society, be victorious over the opponents on earth, and convert all the Jews. For fundamentalists like Jerry Falwell, the prerequisite for the second coming was the physical restoration of Israel or the return of unconverted Jews to the modern-day Israel. But for the apostles and prophets of the NAR, the prerequisite for the second coming is the spiritual restoration. Starting to see? Or the conversion of Jews to their brand of Christianity. The result has been the development of the messianic communities and missionary training centers around the world. We're going to look at this too. Moreover, while fundamentalists look to the scriptures for secret meaning in current events and messages from God, the modern-day apostles and prophets claim to be the bearers of God's direct ongoing revelation. The results can be bizarre. The leading thinker of the NAR, C. Peter Wagner, stated on NPR in 2011 that the nuclear meltdown in Fukushima was a result of the Japanese emperor having sex with the sun goddess, and there is a lot of demonic control in Congress, and that demons can possess entire cities as well, that it's important to cast spells to protect politicians from witchcraft, and that non-Christian religions are part of the kingdom of darkness. All in 1 hour with Terry Gross. And yet the NAR is not on the fringe, but at the center of today's Republican Party. The response, a massive Houston prayer event hosted by Rick Perry in 2011, was led by prominent NAR apostles and prophets, joined by other Christian right leaders. Perry's event was patterned after and led by leaders from the Call events, hosted around the world by, quote, Prophet Lou Engle and Mike Bickle, head of the International House of Prayer. We'll touch on all these organizations so you understand how they came about. These events focus on fighting abortion and gay rights and on proselytizing Jews in order to bring about the second coming. That's what you need to remember. Engle's events include one held in Jerusalem and another in Uganda, where local apostles in the movement spoke in support of the Kill the Gays bill, then under consideration by the Ugandan parliament. Other Republican politicians have looked to this religio-political movement for support as well, including Newt Gingrich, Sarah Palin, Sam Brownback, Duke Iowa of Hawaii, Catherine Harris of Florida, and many more. One of the NAR's training centers, the Messianic Jewish Bible Institute in Dallas is an interesting place, featured President George W. Bush as the keynote speaker at its annual fundraising gala. Now, if you know that George W. Bush is a Skull and Bones member, then that should raise an eyebrow. The NAR has steadily taken over the world of Christian Zionism. The prayer for Israel at Rick Perry's event was not led by John Hagee, but by Apostle Don Finto, the author of the classic text on supporting Messianic communities, i.e. converted Jews with NAR-style evangelical beliefs. Another very important thread. Finto openly called for the conversion of the Jews and was joined by the rabbi of one of the nation's most prominent Messianic organizations. This call for the conversion of the Jews was repeated at a more recent similar event hosted in Louisiana by Governor Bobby Jindal and also featuring NAR apostles. It's getting louder, folks. They're getting louder. Another key NAR player in Christian Zionism is Finto's disciple, Robert Stearns. Stearns is one of the original directors of CUFI, and his ministry has prominently featured endorsements by Bibi and other Jewish leaders. He's also the co-founder and the leader of the single largest international Christian Zionist event, the Day of Prayer for the Peace of Jerusalem, held annually and involving thousands of churches worldwide, praying that Israel fulfill its God-given mandate. The mandate is clear in Stearns' celebration of the growing number of the Messianic movement in Israel, and his exclamation that these converted Jews are like our elder brothers risen from the dead. These changes were evident earlier this month when Netanyahu spoke to the U.S. Congress on March 3rd. Christian Zionist activists were primed and ready. CUFI had long taught that it is part of a modern reenactment of the Old Testament book of Esther, in which an insider, Esther, a secret Jew in the king's palace, and a cunning outsider, Mordecai, her uncle, saved the Jews of Shushan, today's Iran, from the plot of wicked Haman, which ironically fulfills Ezekiel 38, even though the dispensationalists believe that Ezekiel 38 is in the future, but I digress. It was a nice coincidence that Netanyahu's speech was the day before the Jewish holiday of Purim. I'm sure that was not coordinated at all, which commemorates these events. Prior to his speech, one of the nation's largest Christian magazine publishers, Charisma, featured a call for American Christian Zionists to play Esther to Bibi's Mordecai. The writer, Robert Stearns. In 2011, I wrote that the NAR's proselytizing network is teaching millions of Christians that Jews are spiritually dead and Judaism is rebellion to God, which is true. It is true. You see, this is why it's dangerous. It's always about half-truth, people. The best kind of lie is not an obvious lie. It's a half-truth that puts you a little bit on the path and then takes you off of it immediately. Moving on. Representing a reversal of progress that had been made in interfaith dialogue and an acceptance since the Holocaust. Of course, because they're going from dark to light. 4 years later, the NAR is now at the center of Christian Zionism, itself a crucial part of the shifting, increasingly partisan U.S.-Israel relationship. This was about 7 years ago. Fascinating article. We still have a few more to paint this picture of current events. This is from Political Research Associates. It's titled The New Christian Zionism and the Jews, a Love-Hate Relationship. This is from, this is actually even earlier. This is from 2010. But here's Hagee and Pence. They're all in the same club, of course. It is their beliefs about the end times which drive their activism. The traditional fundamentalist leaders of the movement preach that Jews returning to the Holy Land are a necessary part of the end times in which born-again Christians will escape death as they are raptured into heaven. Jews and other non-believers will remain on earth to suffer under the 7-year reign of the Antichrist. Then, as the story goes, Jesus will come back with his armies, be accepted by the surviving Jews, and reign for 1,000 years. This belief motivates adherents to send funds for West Bank settlements, to lobby for preemptive wars seen as precursors to the end times, and to support Jews in the diaspora to make Aliyah and move to Israel. Now Christian Zionism, along with much of evangelicalism, is being swept by a charismatic movement, which has rewritten the role of the Jews in their end times narrative. These charismatics, like Pentecostals, believe that they are endowed by God with supernatural gifts, such as speaking in tongues and faith healing, which we will look at in great depth. However, these charismatics also believe that God directly reveals new prophecy. That's a key word. to their leaders who are unifying the church in preparation for the end times. Which, oh gosh, so much to talk about. I'm so tempted to just stop and talk. But anyway, in their increasingly popular narrative, it is not unconverted, but only converted or so-called Messianic Jews who will serve as the trigger for the return of Jesus and the advent of the millennial kingdom on earth. Do you understand now what's going on? This growing belief is driving the movement to aggressively proselytize Jews and to support Messianic ministries in both Israel and Jewish communities worldwide. One splinter group has even taken this story to an extreme, saying that they themselves are the true Israelites who will play the prophetic role of establishing heaven on earth by moving to Israel. As we will see, their distinct end times narratives share an implicit anti-Semitism, creating the movement's paradoxical love-hate relationship with the Jews. Far from positive, the obsessive philo-Semitism, or love of the Jews, of Christian Zionists is tied to a volatile and changing view of the end times that also changes their view of how they should support Jews and Israel in fulfilling prophecy. And this obsession has a history of turning ugly. Oh, it'll turn very ugly, folks. So make sure you're in the Word and in the truth. Camouflaged in love and an exuberant support for Israel, Hagi and other Christian Zionists openly teach narratives and parallel the storylines of overt anti-Semitism in which Jews are portrayed not as ordinary people, but as superhuman or subhuman. Anti-Semitism and historic Christian Zionism. The partnership of Christian Zionists with Israeli leaders dates back to the 1970s, when Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin of the Likud party and Christian right leader Jerry Falwell, there he is again, joined forces to oppose the U.S. President Jimmy Carter's support for Palestinian state. Dialectics. Israel's alliance with Christian Zionists has only grown in recent decades. As support from increasingly alienated U.S. Jews lagged, Christian Zionists filled the gap with donations and tourism. Israeli Ambassador Oren even rejected an invitation to attend J Street's October conference while attending Kufi's in July. Even the long-established Christian Zionist narrative has anti-Semitic undertones. Now, I don't agree with this word, anti-Semitic. I'm just reading it for you, so just so you're aware. Christian Zionists talk about themselves as fishers who entice Jews to move to Israel, while, quote, hunters are those who violently force the Jews who are unresponsive to the fishers. This well-used motif found throughout the movement's media is problematic for many reasons, not least in requiring a worldwide wave of anti-Semitism, described by some as a second Holocaust, to ensure Jews fulfill their prophetic destiny. Oh yeah, they will fulfill their prophetic destiny for the beast. Hagi is always careful not to use the phrase second Holocaust. But he drew on this motif when he notoriously said that Hitler was a hunter sent by God, prompting John McCain to reject his endorsement in 2008 in the presidential race. The Anti-Defamation League's Abraham Foxman and other Jewish leaders should not have accepted Hagi at face value when he said he was joining rabbinical discourse in making his Hitler remark. Christian Zionist literature regularly uses this threat of the Second Holocaust to warn or intimidate Jews to move to Israel before it is too late, and steeps it with additional anti-Semitic imagery. In Let My People Go, Tom Hess describes his vision of trains taking fleeing Jews from the major cities of the world as they voluntarily leave for Israel, thus saving themselves from an impending Holocaust. Its cover shows a Jewish businessman chained to Wall Street, and the book is filled with stereotypes of Jews as money-oriented materialists and worse. Yeah, some things are based on truth. Hess's ministry, based in Israel, sends the books to Jewish households around the world, and claims to have distributed tens of thousands to the, quote, fish, as he calls the Jews of Russia and Ukraine. Hess also hosts the annual Christian Governmental Leaders Luncheon in conjunction with the Knesset's Christian Allies Caucus. Another book, Blow the Trumpet in Zion, lists the Jews' final Holocaust above why Christians should love the Jews on its back cover promotion. Its author is Richard Booker, who has worked with Christian Allies Caucus and Jerusalem Connection, headed by former Kufi director James Hutchins. The best-selling book of another prominent Christian Zionist describes this second Holocaust as being beyond the horrors of Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz, all of the death camps combined. Now, if you know the truth about World War II, I'll just leave it at that, then you see where this is going. These Christian Zionists believe a second Holocaust is necessary to force the repentance of the Jews. That's the angle. And this was written a long time ago, like 10, 14 years ago. Hagi argues that this support for Israel has absolutely nothing to do with eschatology. This is the interesting thing I wanted to point to you for John Hagi, referring to end times theology. I'm sure it doesn't, but yet he has built an international broadcast audience advertises reaching 190 nations with his apocalyptic sermons, echoing these themes. So, of course, this has nothing to do with end times views. Hagi often delivers these sermons while standing in front of large panels illustrating figures of the end times, including the Antichrist, who he describes as gay and partially Jewish, as was Adolf Hitler. So you see, Hagi knows a few things about World War II. Because there's another important detail. If you know that Hitler was part Jewish, then you know another important detail about that, because there's something that people don't realize about Hitler. Most people don't, at least. And the, quote, great harlot of Mystery Babylon, whom Hagi claims represents Romanism or the Catholic Church. Isn't that interesting? I just think that's so fascinating. If that's not proof of a Jesuit operative in the foray of Christian Zionism leading the charge, I don't know what is. So fascinating. Just tell you on face value what they're doing. Former Israeli ambassador Dore Gold, when questioned about the dangers of this end times eschatology, which ends with the destruction of Judaism, of course it does, because it has to be integrated, responded, quote, all religions have eschatology. The question is whether somebody believes they can move the clock of eschatology forward by themselves. This is a good question, and it will be a point we'll touch on again at the very end of this presentation. The only one who says that is Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran. But in fact, many Christian Zionists do believe they can move the clock. As a quick glance at ArmageddonBooks.com shows, among the titles, Hastening the Messiah, Your Role in Fulfilling Prophecy, the author, Johannes Fascius, is a former head of Ebenezer Emergency Fund and Operation Exodus, credited with moving over 116,000 Jews to Israel from the former Soviet Union. Hagi's mentor wrote the foreword. Its fourth chapter is titled Fishers and Hunters. John Hagi's ministry magazine also suggests evangelicals can move the clock by donating to Hagi's ministry. In an issue with a dramatic war scene and words, World War III has begun on its cover, a page 2 ad solicits funds with the headline, Become a Part of Biblical Prophecy. The ad's donation form states, I want to be part of fulfillment of prophecy and the courageous effort to return Jewish families to the homeland. You can be part of fulfilling prophecy. Just sign on the dotted line, and for the low payment of $9.99, you too, my friend, can be part of God's unfolding plan. This is the Great Delusion, folks. This is the Great Delusion, and it has many threads that are integrating. But one of them, which I will repeat in the future, is synergism, which is a false view of salvation. All of these people are synergists, meaning they believe in libertarian free will, that you need to do something, and of course that opens you up to being deceived with things like, hey, be part of Bible prophecy right now, just sign $9.99 and you can help the Bible fulfill itself, and we can rush the clock and get Jesus to come back. If you understand that God is sovereign, and you believe in the God of the Bible, not in the God of your imagination, then you realize that God responds to no. He's not contingent on anybody. He decrees and he does. You are not going to invoke God to come sooner or do things to make him arrive, sooner than he purposed to. What does that say about you? That says that you have more power than God. Do you see how this is inherently Antichrist? But moving on, we still have just a few to read, and we're going to put it all together. This is now from 2021. Christian Zionist religious scapes in Brazil. Understanding Judaism practices and Zionist inclinations in Brazilian charismatic evangelicalism. This is in South America. The increasing appropriation by charismatic evangelicals of Jewish narratives, rituals, and even Zionist anxieties is now evident in many parts of the globe. Drawing on two cases, one based on a Brazilian neo-Pentecostal church and another based on an ethnographic investigation of Judaism evangelical community in Brazil, This study interrogates to what extent we can comprehend this emerging tendency within Brazilian charismatic evangelicalism as a result of the spread of Anglo-American Christian Zionism. The image of the beast is being slowly constructed and exported to the world. Not yet, it's not fully done yet, so we have to wait for that. A couple, maybe more months, years, who knows, but moving on. The article contends that while there are significant overlaps between Anglo-American Christian Zionism and the Zionist and Judaizing tendencies within Brazilian charismatic evangelicalism, it is reductionist to comprehend the Brazilian case exclusively through Anglo-American frameworks. Given the particularities of the Brazilian charismatic evangelical context, this article points to the unique ways in which Christian Zionist tendencies are being localized in this country. So they're doing their own flavor of the image of the beast too. They're building their own thing. But of course, it's all influenced by the false prophet. Christian Zionism in the United States, 1930 to 2020. This is from last year, September 2023. It's another study. In the United States, there have been varying levels of politically active support for Israel from theologically diverse Christians. However, after 1967, the base of Christian Zionism in the United States was consolidated among theologically conservative evangelicals who viewed Israel in the prophetic terms and interpretations, interpreted events in Israel through that theological lens. It was consolidated by Jerry Falwell and all these other Jesuit operatives to get ready for the new thing. Beginning in the 1970s and continuing into the 21st century, the politically active base of Christian Zionism became increasingly defined by the most conservative elements of the American evangelicalism and the Christian right. Christian Zionists were among the fiercest critics of the Obama administration, whom they argued was putting Israel in existential danger and therefore inviting divine punishment on the United States. Conversely, Christian Zionists as a subset of evangelicals were among Donald Trump's biggest supporters, and I covered that in my Donald Trump expose. And through his administration, they achieved many of their political aspirations, such as moving the United States Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and withdrawing from the Iran nuclear deal. So there was a evolution of Christian Zionism, and Christian Zionism, which is dispensationalism, but kind of really more extreme, was fused with all the people who are all about Christian nationalism. And it's all going to come together with the NAR movement. Christian Zionism, Christian nationalism, and the threat to democracy. This is from September of last year. Let's see what we got. The Israel-Hamas war has activated Christian Zionists in U.S. politics and amplified the threat that MAGA forces pose now and in the 2024 elections. AIPAC, which is embracing the Republican right, is expected to spend $100 million to defeat members of the squad. Current Speaker of the House Mike Johnson is a Christian Zionist who supports the Israel right. He's also a Christian nationalist. AIPAC and the Anti-Defamation League may believe it is expedient to align with religious leaders like Hagi. In doing so, they ignore the real danger to the Jews in the U.S., which comes from the mainstreaming of the Christian far right. Christian Zionism refers to a movement among Christians, mostly charismatic and evangelical, which it wasn't that way in the beginning. Very interesting. Whose interpretation of the Bible mandates their political support not just for the modern state of Israel, but an expansionist version thereof. The government believes that the entirety of Jerusalem, particularly the Temple Mount, where they expect to see the temple rebuilt, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and the Golan Heights all rightfully belong to Israel. A biblical land grant that doesn't merely fulfill a scriptural promise to the Jewish people, but stands as the cornerstone of the Christian prophecies and is a sign that the end times are close upon us. It's a common belief among U.S. evangelicals, some 63 to 80% of whom profess that the establishment of Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of prophecy, and an indication that the second coming is drawing near. How near? According to one 2010 poll by the Pew Research Center, 58% of white evangelicals and 41% of all Americans believe that Jesus will probably return by 2050, which is true. Definitely the world doesn't have that much more time, but the question is, what are you watching? Are you watching Israel or are you watching the right things? because if you're watching Israel, you're going to get caught up in the Great Delusion. Corrosive to democracy. Christian Zionism is politically opportunistic, mobilizing both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim bigotry in ways calculated to capitalize on the fears of the moment. The opportunism is wedded to shifting interpretations of prophecy. In his book Beginning of the End, The Assassination of Yitzhak Rabin and the Coming Antichrist, Hagi interprets the prophetic significance of the 1995 assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. There was no prophetic significance. Rabin's role in the Oslo Accords, in Hagi's interpretation, led to the possibility of his assassination being used as an excuse to double down on peace. He wrote, "Based on the words of the prophets of Israel, I believe this peace process will lead to the most devastating war Israel has ever known. After that war, the longed-for Messiah will come." The Antichrist is going to come, but anyway, my 2016, of course I don't mean personal Antichrist, but really just the fulfillment of all these prophecies that the Bible actually says, not that the dispensationalists say. By 2016, of course, it wasn't an imminent war that was signaling the close arrival of the Messiah, but rather Trump's relocation of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, of course, because Trump is a Jesuit-trained operative to bring about the new thing. Such convenient interpretive moves must not be reduced to a penchant for charlatanism. Between Rabin's assassination and the embassy move, Hagi built Kufi into a juggernaut with millions of members and staunch allies in the Trump administration, including Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo. So when Kufi takes credit for the embassy relocation, it's more than boasting. Through one-on-one meetings with both Trump and Pence, Hagi stressed the move was important to his constituency, a claim backed up by 137,000 supportive emails from Kufi members to the White House. It's crazy. Christian Zionist organizations are thus in a feedback loop relationship with the Trump administration, watching their allies get appointed as insiders who are then validated by constituent activism. Pence has not only spoken at Kufi events, his public statements put him firmly in the camp of Christian Zionism. Pompeo is similarly committed to Christian Zionist principles and has aligned himself with Kufi. While there is no religious test for holding high office in the United States, such public support for a cause so openly biased by the very people responsible for guiding U.S. foreign policy is cause for the gravest concern. It is. If you have any shred of discernment, you realize all of this is being staged and choreographed to bring everybody under the final system, which will be a Christian nationalist system. At the very least, such positioning undermines the capacity for the U.S. to engage in peacemaking, not just in Israel-Palestine, but more broadly. So, now that we've taken a wide swath in the last, 14 years or so, what do we take from this? Well, hopefully you're starting to see where I'm going with this, and we have so much to get into in this mini-series message, basically. So much to get into. I truly hope to blow your mind. But as you can see with current events, there's a couple things that are very important to highlight. First off, Zionism was created by the papacy to suit its agenda, and I will prove that to you later in this message. The reason is because it fulfills the false prophecy they created 500 years ago with the Jesuits, and basically led to dispensationalism. We'll document all of this. And it also has other roles like creating, a reason for endless wars, boosting the petrodollar, keeping America strong, because America, of course, is a weapon of the beast, and it's the false prophet that will bring everybody to the beast through all of these things like Christian Zionism, the NR movement. All these things are happening in America. So America needs to stay strong, and we need a reason for all these endless wars. So there's a lot of things to discuss. In 1871, America became a papal instrument. And we'll look at that because that's the act of 1871 when the Rothschilds basically took over the country officially. And of course, the Rothschilds are a Jesuit, arm of the Jesuits. So anyway, there's a lot of history to talk with that as well, so you understand why there's a Middle East reason with all this conflict. But it serves a lot of different purposes. Christian Zionism came out of dispensational theology. We'll look at the history of that. But basically, by the 1970s, you had a solidification among conservatives. So dispensationalism doesn't necessarily, in the beginning, it wasn't like just the conservatives. But by the 1970s, with all the things that happened with Zionism and the State of Israel, and other agents like Jerry Falwell, who started the Moral Majority, it fused Zionism, Christian Zionism, with conservative right. and all these Christian nationalist type of people that set the stage. I talk about Jerry Falwell in my Image of the Beast episode in my End Time series, and he's very likely a Jesuit or secret society pawn pretending to be a Protestant, just like so many. It's very obvious. But nonetheless, he set the foundation for a lot of the stuff that you see now, which is this fusion of all these things: Christian Zionism, Christian nationalism, the far right, the NAR movement, so on and so forth. Dispensationalism, although it's Jewish focused, the Jews are the center of Bible prophecy. In essence, it was initially just passive, in the sense that, okay, well, the Jews need to return to their homeland, and then the rapture is going to happen, and we're not going to be around for the rest. There's going to be an antichrist. They're going to, experience tribulation, and then they'll convert. But we're not concerned with that. We just need to get them to their homeland. That was the original kind of thinking with dispensationalism. And because of all the changes that I just reported to, and that we will document in great detail in coming sections, it is changing, and it's changing very rapidly from being passive to active, to where now, because of the charismatic movement and the NAR and all the things that we're talking about, Christian Zionism has become active, or dispensationalism has become an active thing. We need to get the Jews converted. Of course, one of the things it draws on is Matthew 23. This is verse 37 to 39, lament over Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings? And you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So now, of course, I have a whole episode in my End Time series on this, debunking this idea that this is a Jewish revival that Jesus is talking about. As usual, Jesus is talking about something spiritual, and the devil has flipped it to put your attention on something physical and fleshly. Jesus is not talking about a future revival of the Jews here, but this is what Christian Zionists use. Classic dispensationalism would interpret this as, well, the Jews will have a revival during the tribulation, after the rapture at some point in time. NAR Christian Zionism, which is the new thing, says we need to convert the Jews so that Jesus can come. We need to do something. We need to rush that prophetic clock, folks. When they are converted, then Jesus is going to show up, because now we're in the end time, so everything's getting better and the world's going to get Christianized, and then Jesus is going to show up. Do you see how this is all tied together? Now, of course, the true meaning is that Jesus is talking about something spiritual. He's the teacher. He's the master. He's always teaching. And a common approach that rabbis would do at that time they would cite a verse from a particular psalm, because people had the scriptures memorized. I mean, they were studying the Bible all the time. Of course, for them, it wasn't called the Bible, but anyway. When a rabbi would point to a verse, the point was like you would remember the entire psalm or whatever was being cited. And the point is like, go read that psalm. That's what I'm talking about right now. So this is what he's doing here. He's pointing to Psalm 118, and specifically verse 26. Blessed he who comes in the name of the Lord, we bless you from the house of the Lord. And what is this psalm about? Well, it's really his steadfast love endures forever. Let Israel say his steadfast love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say his steadfast love endures forever. Out of my distress I called on the Lord, and the Lord answered me and set me free. What is this about? This psalm is about repentance, giving glory to God, coming back and trusting the Lord that he will reward you. It's a psalm celebrating these things. The Lord is on my side, I will not fear. What can man do to me? The Lord is on my side as my helper. I shall look in triumph on those who hate me. This is a psalm celebrating trusting in the Lord. Did the Jews of Jesus' time trust in the Lord? No, they didn't. And it was time for Jesus to get crucified and resurrect and ascend so he could start ruling, because the millennial kingdom is right now, by the way. But that's another point of deception. Of course, most of you probably are watching this already know that. If you don't, then watch my End Time series. Watch Revelation 20, my episode on Revelation 20. The millennium is right now. It's a spiritual reality. And he had to go ascend and fulfill the vision of Daniel 7 when the Son of Man is presented before the Ancient of Days and received dominion. So he fulfilled that. And what he's lamenting is, listen, you had your chance to see me in the flesh. You're not going to see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, i.e., until you have the attitude of this Psalm of 118, and you return to God in repentance and faith, you aren't going to see who I am. And it's true, you're not going to see him. Because again, the Bible says the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, and that the devil has blinded the minds of unbelievers, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Well, yeah, he's blinded you so that you don't see that the cross is your salvation, that Jesus is your Savior, that he is God in the flesh. You don't see that until God opens your eyes. And that's what Jesus is lamenting here. He's not saying, you're not going to see me until you do something that I need to react to. Do you see the point? Why would Jesus say that when everything has been predetermined? He tells you ahead of time what's happening. So much prophecy did Jesus give. Do you think he's going to be inconsistent and say, yeah, I'm not going to return until you guys get it together and believe so that you have a revival, and then I'm going to return? Well, wait a minute, because in John 6, Jesus says that no man can come to him unless the Father draws that person, gives them to Christ, teaches them, and grants them to come to Christ. How does that work with this idea of a Jewish revival in the future? Well, it doesn't. It's inconsistent. And we know God is completely consistent. Therefore, that's not what Jesus is talking about. Because the only people that can come to him in faith are the ones that the Father gives to Christ. And Christ cannot lose those people. Do you see why it's so important to have right theology on salvation? So you don't get snared by these very seductive interpretations? They're all spiritual, and it requires spiritual eyes to see. But of course, the NAR movement and the charismatic movement, all the stuff that are driving MAGA, Christian nationalism, the Great Awakening or the Great Reawakening America Tour, all this stuff, Christian Zionism, this is the new thing. And they're totally seduced by the forbidden fruit of, we have to do something and free will, and we can push the clock and things like that. So they're pushing for the conversion of the Jews. A lot of these things like, Flynn, I think we'll look at one article in the future, but Flynn and his various events that he's doing with Reawaken America Tour, they're baptizing people. These people are speaking in tongues and having charismatic experiences, being delivered of demons. I mean, I talk about this in my Counterfeit Spirit episode in the End Time series. I've talked about it in my Charismatic Quackery episode. But here's the point. The first phase of all this was dispensationalism. And we're going to look at all these individually. We're starting to unpack it now. The first phase of all this was dispensationalism, which was ultimately designed to deceive Christians into not seeing the beast, hiding the beast's identity. That was the first wave through dispensationalism. Then the second wave was Christian Zionism through political things happening with the state of Israel and allowing that to influence or push this eschatological mindset of dispensationalism into the far right crowd. The third phase was the charismatic movement, and these are not linear in the sense that they're happening one after the other. You have to understand, and my goal hopefully will be to paint a clear enough picture. You could see these things were happening layer upon layer. Of course, they are in order to some degree. Dispensationalism, then obviously Christian Zionism, then the charismatic Pentecostal phase. These things are overlapping, but they did start at different times. But nonetheless, the third phase, which is the Pentecostal charismatic phase, set the stage to flip the paradigm. Do you see the point? Because now the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation, is integrating all of these things: Christian nationalism, Christian Zionism, dispensationalism, the charismatic thing. It's integrating all these things into one hodgepodge Great Delusion. And now they've flipped the script on their eschatology, which is, we interpret this as a spiritual thing. We need to convert the Jews. It's not that they need to have their own revival during the tribulation. We need to convert the Jews. That's how we're going to get Jesus to come. This has happened probably over the last 200 years, and we're going to look at it very clearly, so you're very educated on how it happened. But ultimately, what happened? The puppet masters snared the Jews with Christian Zionism. with all the money they were pumping into Israel, they snared the Jews and they built all these relationships, only to flip on them with the NAR. And now, oh, sorry, Jews, you got to convert. See how this works? So the people who think that the Jews run the world and, the Zionist agenda is, we need to watch out for the Noahide laws. Look, you need to understand that Satan has many vehicles, okay? Satan has a lot of vehicles on the earth. Zionism is one of them. Secret societies are one of them. The Jesuits are one of them. There's so many. But the Bible, in God's infinite genius, such infinite genius, he vividly portrays to you who the head of the snake is and who you need to pay attention to, where all the roads lead to, because if you don't have that vision, then you do not see clearly. The snake has created so many narratives that it's easy to get lost. But God gives you what to focus on. And he says that the papacy is the beast, and the woman riding the beast is the Catholic Church. That's who you need to focus on and where all these things are integrating. And in his infinite genius, he gave you prophecy upon prophecy to tell you what to focus on. So it's not the Jews that are the puppet masters. It's the puppet masters of the Jews, like the puppet masters of everybody else, that are steering and using the Jews. And you will see the Jews have so many roles for the people in charge. They have so many purposes for them, and they're just being used, folks. That's the sad part to me. It really is. They're just being used. But the elect in that group will come to faith one way or another. So we have to trust that. So remember a few important things. The future is Christian nationalist. Just like it was for 1400 years, it will be worldwide under the beast. The kings of the earth will give their power to the woman. That is going to happen. The future is not Jewish, it's not Zionist, it's not Muslim, it's not communist, it's not globalist. It is Christian nationalist. The Jews will be integrated, and so will the Muslims. And both Zionism and Islam were created by the beast, but Zionism especially was created for a particular purpose with this whole third temple thing to foster the Great Delusion, to bring people back. It's so phenomenally evil. I realize now why John, when he sees the vision of Mystery Babylon, marvels. It says he marveled greatly. And I hope that you will realize why he marveled greatly. I marvel greatly at the evil and how they're coordinating this. It's truly profound. And I also marvel even more greatly that God revealed these things to me and showed me how all these things integrate. And I hope that you will see and delight in it as well. But nonetheless, once they're done with Zionism, they're going to destroy it. And that's what's happening, just like they did with Hitler, they're just like they did with everything else in history. They create these things and then they destroy them to bring about the capstone, the final thing. Today, Israel and the old Zionist order is getting exposed to this whole Gaza war. And it's just in time for the NAR to reach maximum, critical momentum. Do you see the point of these two things happening? The Gaza war is revealing to everybody the Zionist state of Israel and all of its machinations throughout the world. And people are starting to wake up to, all the things that are been done by them. Just in time, as parallel to this, the NAR is sweeping the world. Nobody's talked about the Jews in the last 20 years out in the open. Nobody criticized Israel. Now everybody's starting to do it. Do you think that's just happening? No, it's by design, folks, because the Jews need to get converted. They need to get converted because this is now the dark to light that they're going to run on the Jews with the NAR movement. And it's time. And of course, what do they do? They're doing the same thing that they're doing with the quote-unquote deep state, with the Christian nationalists in the U.S. Look at the globalists, and they're revealing to you all this obvious evil. And of course, that polarizes you to their side if you don't have discernment. But of course, if you listen to my stuff, you will have discernment. And if you listen to all this, you certainly will have much bigger ears, I promise you. But they're doing the same thing they're doing in the U.S. with the deep state, with Israel. Now, Israel's getting exposed. And so everybody's being polarized. The people who are, all about, let's say even the dispensationalists, the old school ones that were about sending the Jews just to their homeland, now they're starting to realize, well, maybe we need to convert them because they're so antichrist. You see how all this is going? It's just so fascinating if you know your history and how history repeats itself. So how are the Jews going to be integrated? Well, the Third Temple dialectic will either, we'll talk about some of this, bring a false Christ, false return of Christ, which will lead to mass conversion, or some kind of world peace from like a dialectic between conflict in the Middle East, which will foster a charismatic revival in Israel. Now, it's very interesting. A point that I will mention again is that if you know your history, these things are nothing really surprising. When Constantine passed his Sunday laws, initially, it was just kind of like, don't work on Sunday type of thing. But within 100 years, 150 years, you had the Council of Laodicea, you had other councils that basically started to say, listen, if you are resting on Saturday, you're Judaizing. You're being like the Jews. And if you're Judaizing, you're going to be shut out from Christ. And of course, if you're shut out from Christ, then, that's a real problem for you because no buy or sell, no, benefits. You might even be killed as a heretic. So if you understand that that happened already with the system of the first beast, which the image of the beast is an image of, that means it has aspects of that first beast, right? Does it make sense? Well, what was a big part of that first beast in terms of persecuting people for keeping the Sabbath? Well, it was using the Jews as an excuse. You're going to see how all this ties together. It's so truly profound. But the Jews will serve a purpose in bringing all the Christians together under the beast through this NAR thing, the new thing that fuses Christian nationalism with Zionism and everything else. The Jews will also serve a very important purpose to accuse Sabbath-keeping Christians and help pass anti-Sabbath laws. If you don't know what I'm talking about, see my Sabbath series number 7, number 8, my timeline to the end video. We're going to talk about this in more depth in a future part of this message. So now that you understand the present, it's time to unravel this big ball of satanic yarn and to see how all these threads come together. Our first stop is proving that dispensationalism has its roots in Jesuit theology.